Like many educators today, including some that have been on this podcast, Jon England was a longtime public school teacher who left the classroom to pursue other education related opportunities. He worked in the public schools for 14 years, teaching fifth and sixth grades and also working as an elementary school administrator. Jon received his bachelor's degree in elementary education from the University of Utah and a master's degree in educational leadership from Western Governors University. He also spent time as a sergeant in the U.S. Marine Corps. Today, Jon is an education policy analyst at the Libertas Institute in Utah, working to support education entrepreneurship and K-12 innovation, among other policy initiatives. He and his wife also recently launched a podcast called Dimond Education, which helps other parents find the best educational fit for their children. Jon England, welcome to the Liberated Podcast.
Gary, thank you so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, I'm so glad that you're here. I just love your story. And I think it's so representative of many of the stories I hear of longtime public school educators who decide to leave the system to pursue other opportunities. And that was certainly your story. But before we get to kind of why you left, let's start at why you went into education in the first place. What was sort of the catalyst for your interest in this career path?
Yeah, I mean, education has always been something that has been really important to me in my life. I love learning personally. And actually, when I was in college, my dad came out. I was looking at a couple different careers, and he has a job of helping people, especially people who are coming out of prison, find their career. So he walked me actually through that process, and I landed on education being a possibility just because of my love of learning, and that could translate into the classroom. But in high school, I had a really fabulous teacher. And the unfortunate thing is that these fabulous teachers are sometimes few and far between. And sometimes they have to bend the rules like a John Taylor Gatto to do the right thing. But he had a major impact, and just he didn't really do anything like life-changing necessarily, but his love of biology, which is what he taught, really rubbed off on me and made me really interested in the education field. And so that, combined with my love of learning, made it, education a really good fit of why I wanted to go into that and just help other children to learn and to grow. I came from a low income background. I was actually homeless in fifth grade. And so I knew that education for me was a way out of poverty. And I wanted that also to translate to these children that I was working with.
Just incredible. And so you spent almost a decade and a half in the public school system. About half that time was as a classroom teacher, half the time was an administrator. So what was it that prompted you to leave the system and look for other opportunities?
Yeah, I started as I was in education. One of the things that really kind of started noticing was that it wasn't working for every child there. And that was a big frustration for me. When I was teaching, I taught in low income schools, Title I schools. And, there's a lot of things that I realized as a teacher, like, hey, I have a kid who maybe needs some extra help with these different things. And it was really difficult to try and get them that help. And then as an administrator, I noticed that really quickly. There were students who, within the first couple of weeks, parents had come to me and said, hey, I noticed that my kid's really struggling with X, Y, or Z. Can you help? And sometimes to get them just a little bit of extra help, even like an hour of aid time a day or something like that, there's a lot of hoops that I had to jump through to try and help this child out. And even though I knew, the teacher knew, the parents knew, this child needed something different, sometimes it would take us 6-7 months to be able to legally do that. And so at times I bent the rules and just did it because I knew it was the right thing for the child's education. But it was just really a big frustration. And then, as an administrator, I also began noticing like the micromanagement that was starting to happen. I was talking with other veteran principals who had been around for 14, 15 years during my first few years of being a principal. And they mentioned, like, it didn't used to be like this. As a school principal, you actually had some authority to make some decisions for your school specifically. And that changed. I started feeling really micromanaged. And in fact, I would say that there were times where I felt more micromanaged as a school principal than I did being in the Marine Corps, as, a private first class or something like that. And so it was really frustrating that I couldn't provide what the child needed without jumping through all these hoops and a big delay, which was detrimental to their education.
Sure, many listeners are surprised to hear you say that you felt more micromanaged, maybe more controlled as an elementary school principal than you did as a Marine Corps sergeant, and speaks to sort of this increasing standardization and one size fits all model of district schooling. Yeah, and that was so eye-opening for you personally and professionally as well when you got out of the system, to not only what the opportunities were, but also it sounded like you went through this evolution of thinking in terms of what education is, the idea of education as much bigger and broader than schooling. And in fact, it led you and your wife to think about educating your children differently in the past couple of years. Can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So I always thought of myself as a really innovative teacher when I was teaching fifth and sixth grade. But since I've gotten out and I've started meeting education entrepreneurs, listening to your podcast and hearing all these wonderful teachers that are out there just doing things differently than we even had an opportunity to in the public system, I realized that I was looking at education through blinders. The innovations that are out there are amazing. But yeah, like you said, last school year, my wife and I decided to take the leap, and we started homeschooling 3 of our children. I have 5 kids. Started homeschooling 3 of them. We sent one to a local micro school that's really classically oriented. That's something that really appeals to my wife and I, and she's loved it. The daughter that we sent there. And then my oldest kind of was very resistant to it at first. So she actually started last year as a full-time high school student in the local public school. And then by the halfway through, she was only half-time in the public school and half-time being homeschooled. And this year she's fully homeschooled and she's loving it. In fact, we just had a conversation with her about she really loves like entrepreneurship and things like that, and so she's taking some classes right now from the local ATC, which she may not have been able to as a high school student currently. And she's taking these classes. She wants to open a nail tech business, possibly even a mobile one, and go to people's homes. And she just like, this is something I could do. It's something I could make money at, and she loves it. And we asked her like, well, do you think you'll be able to stay up with her homework? Because that's something that she's always struggled with. She's like, oh, I'll be able to. And we asked her why, and she's like, well, it's because I'm interested in it, which is something that like I've learned from your podcast and things like that. The more the kids have interest in what they're learning, the better their outcomes that they have. There's actually a study, and I need to find the reference for it because it's an old one, but they've shared in public education a lot of my trainings I've seen, and they broke children into 4 categories. They had a high interest in the subject they were reading about, and they were good, and then broke it down on their reading ability too. So kind of this cross section there. And obviously the kids who had high interest and high reading ability had the best comprehension of the book or the article that they were reading. But the surprising thing is that the kids who with the high interest were the second highest group in their comprehension, not the high readers, but the ones with high interest. When kids are interested in something, this is something I've learned recently, education is easy actually, because they want to learn it. They're driven to learn it. And so there's none of this pulling teeth that I'm sure a lot of public school parents are familiar with, of trying to get them to do like homework and things like that.
so interesting. And it actually reminds me of the podcast episode we had recently with Molly and Noah Stevenson, who run a micro school in Wichita, Kansas. And they were talking about their own experience toward unschooling and self-directed education with their own children, and their son sort of refusing to read. They were going to send him back to public school. And then he discovered a middle grade biography way above his reading level. He wasn't even reading Dr. Seuss at the time, but was interested in Johnny Cash in this biography and ended up reading it, and then kind of took off as a reader because, like you said, he was so interested in it. And so you've discovered that now with your own children over the past couple of years. You're so reflective there too of what's happening in the country as a whole in terms of families choosing to leave district schools over the past couple of years at record rates for homeschooling, for private education, for micro schools, for charter schools. So just a lot of parent empowerment. I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about what led you and your wife to make a change educationally for your kids.
Well, I think for a lot of families, COVID really opened everybody's eyes into the fact that education can look different than what we were used to, what I grew up with and what I was doing. I think that's something that is true across the board is, that first year going back, a lot of people were just, their kids were just sitting on a Zoom call, but it wasn't like this, like you and I are having, but they were just listening for hours on end. And they're like, well, I can at least read them a book and something they're interested in, and so they started experimenting with these different things. And, it led to this proliferation, as you've seen, of these micro schools, homeschool pods popped up all over the place. In fact, I was a principal during that school year. And one of the things that we noticed right off, the school district I was working for had an idea of having the classroom teacher do both in person, and Utah came back to in person, unlike a lot of other areas, but Utah came back to in person that year following the shutdowns of everything. And but they wanted to have the classroom teacher do the in person and the online teaching, and that was just untenable. It was horrible for the teachers, it was horrible for the parents, and it was horrible for the students. It was just a bad product overall. And parents started leaving the district. We had 700 students leave our school district in the first month. And I remember sitting in a meeting with where the business administrator for the district came in and said, hey, we got to do something different. And by the end of the school year, or by the end of the quarter, which was a month away, we all of a sudden had a dedicated online school to provide online learning for those families that wanted that, because what we were doing didn't work. And so it was the fastest innovation within public schools that I saw in my entire 14-year career, the fastest change we ever had, because there were market pressures to keep the kids there. And so they had to improve their product. It was amazing to see. And so, but going back to your original question, my wife and I, we saw the product that we were getting for our children, and just decided we wanted something different. It didn't align with our values, some of the stuff that they were doing, and we just wanted to have a bigger hand in it. And we took the leap. And so, yeah, here we are, and we would not go back.
Yeah. So you took the leap with granting your children a different way of being educated outside of the system, using these micro schools and other kinds of education resources around you. And you also took the leap professionally into this new career as an education policy analyst at Libertas. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do at Libertas and what Libertas's mission is?
Yeah, so within education, and Libertas deals with a lot of policies, but specifically within education, Libertas's goal is to give parents, students, and teachers the ability to innovate and improve education on their own, in that order, really, because it's the parents who understand the children. I mean, asking a 6 or 7-year-old to be like, hey, how do you want to learn? Sometimes they're still kids. They need some guidance of, hey, you interested in this? No? Okay, let's look at this other thing. And because they don't know what's out there, but that's what we're working on. And so right now we have a couple of big kind of policy pushes that we're doing within education. We're hoping to pass an ESA, an education savings account, similar to what they passed in Arizona and in West Virginia a couple of years ago, to give parents that opportunity to control the state funds to find the education that is the right fit for them. That's something that, as you look at places like Arizona and West Virginia, like there's starting to be a proliferation of innovation there because entrepreneurs realize, hey, I can not only go there, but I might actually be able to make money doing it, and creating these innovations. And so that's something that we're really working on. That's our major focus. Alternatively, we've found, and you've probably found within your work, that a lot of these education entrepreneurs are running into a lot of problems on startup, and it's not necessarily the education department that they're having problems with. It's more their local governments, zoning laws, occupancy, fire code, health code, all these things that are these roadblocks to really being innovative and being able just to get up off the ground. It's a really heavy lift, and the ones here in Utah that I've talked to have had to have a really large nest egg that they are willing to burn through to even just get up off the ground, which is really a big roadblock in starting something new.
Yeah, so I was thrilled to be able to head out to Utah over the summer and meet with you and a couple dozen education entrepreneurs across the state at an education entrepreneurship workshop to identify some of these hurdles, some of these roadblocks that education entrepreneurs encounter when they're starting or trying to expand their organizations. And you are kind of taking those insights and those stories and thinking about ways to influence policy or recommend changes to make it easier for these education entrepreneurs. And it's really about deregulation, right? Removing barriers. We're not promoting, additional barriers or additional policies. It's really just trying to loosen up what's there. And I know, on the podcast, I had Connor Boyack, who founded the Libertas Institute, on over the summer to talk about a variety of things, including the quote unquote regulatory sandbox that Libertas instituted in the realm of public education to hopefully help current educators in the system to be innovative. But now you're working specifically on these innovative educators outside the system to help them flourish. Can you talk a little bit more about what that looks like?
Yeah. So one of the things that when we met with you back in August that came out of that is a lot of the entrepreneurs would really love to have an opportunity to collaborate together, coming from this place of plenty and realizing that, like, hey, we might be able to join forces and maybe we find some professional development, even though maybe you're teaching a classical model, but these guys are doing more of an Acton model. There might be some things there that we can collaborate on and work together to just improve our own business models. Maybe it's an accounting course, who knows? Like, just these different supports that these entrepreneurs are looking for to find their way to improve their practice within what they're doing. And so we are looking to help them start like an association of some kind to help them provide that. Some of these entrepreneurs are having a hard time finding things, even like insurance, of who can I go to insurance. And so the people that are a little farther down the road can share some of that knowledge, and being able to improve it that way, but also being able to navigate the just vast array of regulations that are within cities. If you have somebody who's done it, you can have that conversation and be able to say, hey, when the inspector came in and said, I need to have this, or this, maybe they're asking him to, one entrepreneur had to install an elevator, even though, federal law didn't require that. The city code required an elevator into their school. So we had to install an elevator, which is not a small expense, right? And so being able to navigate things like that and being able to talk about what are the ways that we can work together to understand the codes. So that's one thing that we're working on. The other thing that we're really working on, like you said, is to deregulate what's going on, loosening up these restrictions on these education innovators, because they are doing such amazing work and helping so many families who are looking for something. The unfortunate thing is public education doesn't fit every child. And so having a proliferation of options for parents to go and find what works for their child is a really good thing. There's actually a young man in my neighborhood who I look at him, he's in the public system, but I mean, he knows everything about engines. He can tear apart a motorcycle and put it back together with very little direction from anybody else. He maybe needs to watch a YouTube channel or something like that, but he struggles with reading. He's not a fluent reader necessarily, and he doesn't necessarily love going to school for all these different things, but he loves engines. He could probably begin a business today with the knowledge that he has on how to fix a motorcycle. But if there's a school that helps him do that, like, why can't that exist? And the unfortunate thing is that, like you said, the regulations that are there are really big roadblocks. And so we want to remove those roadblocks and help these education innovators get up off the ground and provide them, and then let the market decide if it's a good product or not, and not some regulator.
Exactly. Some of the stories that we heard at the education entrepreneurship workshop in August, and that I'm sure you've heard in the weeks since that, are really startling. Some of these stories made me think I would have given up if I had to go through what some of these education entrepreneurs went through, the lawyers that they had to hire in order to fight local and state regulations, the amount of money they had to put up to, again, pay for these lawyers, or to, like you said, put in elevators that really seemed like it wasn't a good match for this kind of micro school model, but they were being kind of put under this umbrella school legislation that required that. It was really quite an uphill climb for many of them, and some of it quite unfair. I remember one micro school founder talked about how they had to comply with various numbers of parking spots that would correlate with how many students were in their school. And this is a rule or regulation that public schools are also under, but public schools typically get variances or exemptions from that rule. And yet micro schools and other kinds of small private education options don't get those exemptions, or don't get them as easily. And so I think that's why your work is so important, to think about, how do you remove some of these barriers? How do you identify them and then remove them, and then work with this group of education entrepreneurs to help them flourish? What have you been most surprised by or interested in when talking with the education entrepreneurs throughout Utah?
Well, I think one of the things that, like I said, that really surprised me was just some of the problems that they ran into as entrepreneurs. There was one founder, he's starting an acting academy down in St. George, and he estimates that the delays and the regulations and the hoops that he had to jump to down there in that city has cost him over $100,000. That's ridiculous. Like, that should not be something that is happening for somebody to begin a business, whether it's an education business or any other type of business, just to get going. I mean, starting a business is already just so difficult, right? I mean, you have to find I forgot the word, a customer base. You have to find a customer base to come in so you can start making money. You have the overhead of renting a place, or maybe you're building your own place. And so just those regulations have been just so devastating, I think, to a lot of these education entrepreneurs that are there. One of the ones that you met, and I believe that you've talked to before, Paul and Javon in Bountiful, they talk about some of their problems that they ran into, to include, one city council telling them, we just don't want a private school in our city boundaries, right? And so this association, going back to that, we're hoping can also provide them some legal services that would provide them some of that legal support, so that they're not having to battle those laws on their own. They have somebody who has an understanding of Utah law, because an entrepreneur having to be an expert in law, in zoning, and in health department code, fire code, all these things like that, that's just a really big regulatory burden that they're having to take on, that they shouldn't have to.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And in some states, it's really easy to start a private school. In other states, it's more difficult. Some states like Utah, you need that local approval. And
honestly, Utah is a really it prides itself on being business friendly. So even in Utah, they're running into these problems of how to start. It's just a really fascinating thing that we say, hey, we're for these business owners, unless it's something that we're not sure what it is. And then so these innovative things. And so that's where things like our sandbox really come in to help other businesses. And we're trying to apply that to the education world as well.
That's so great. I mean, I've heard education entrepreneurs in both red states and blue states, states that lean to the political right and the political left, have these exact same challenges in terms of difficulty in starting a new private school, or districts, school districts or city councils saying, no, you can't have a private school here. This is across the board. So any way that you can kind of remove those barriers and make it more fair for these education entrepreneurs to start and scale their learning organizations, that's better for everybody, and certainly expands more education options for families. So Jon, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what advice you might have for other educators who might still be in a public school or a private school and looking to venture out on their own as an entrepreneur, or look for other kinds of education-related opportunities outside of the system. What advice do you have for them?
I would say do it. Just begin doing it. Especially those in the public system, they realize the regulatory burden that they have upon them. They're always talking about how there's just one more thing added to their plate, right? Well, beginning something new lets you decide what's on the plate. And that is a very powerful thing. So even if you're starting with 10 kids out of your basement, that is something that you could begin doing, and you could provide the education that you always dreamed about providing. Every new teacher coming out of college has these really big hopes and dreams of how they're going to change the world for these children that they're working with. Well, you're probably not going to be able to do that in the public system. It's just so bureaucratic. It's just not going to work super well there. I don't think that's a good fit for some, maybe, right? But it's not going to be the best fit for others. And it might not be the best fit for you as a teacher. And so being willing to step outside and take that risk, I would say do it. It's scary at first. I can attest to that. But it is definitely something that you can do, and you can provide a really quality education that parents are going to want.
Yeah, and that maybe you can find a better fit, a better career fit. Something that's more aligned with your passions and preferences outside of the system. So I love that advice of just give it a shot, see what else is out there, and take the leap. And as I mentioned in the introduction, you and your wife are also helping parents find a better educational fit for their children through your podcast, Dimond Education. Can you tell us a little bit about that and why you started it?
Yeah, we found that a lot of parents don't even know some of the options that are out there. And so that's why we began the podcast. We spell Dimond differently. It's Dimond. That is a family name. And so that's why it's not spelled correctly. But Dimond Education Podcast. Yeah. So we bring in on some of these education entrepreneurs like you are, just to have them talk about their model and help families find that. We've talked to homeschool moms about what does it mean to homeschool. Things like that. Talked about classical education with Jamie Buckland from West Virginia. She's an old classical educator in West Virginia there. And so those are the types of people that we're bringing on to help parents realize that there are other options out there, and that these other options might be a better fit for your child.
So great. So listeners can follow your podcast. How else can they find and connect with you, Jon?
So they can follow me. I'm really active on Twitter, probably in a bad way, but I really love Twitter. I love sending out tweets and things like that. So they can follow me on Twitter at jengland1226. That's my Twitter handle. They can also, if they really would like to connect with me personally, they can send me an email at Libertas, Jon, Jon, at Libertas, Libertas.org. Those are the best ways to connect with me.
And tell us again the podcast.
It's Dimond Education Podcast, Dimond. So we just dropped the A out of Dimond. Like I said, it's a family name. Comes from my wife's side, and it's just a name that we really love. So
Wonderful. Well, best wishes to you, not only in your podcast and reaching parents, but also in the policy world through making it easier for education entrepreneurs in Utah to start and grow their organizations and help give families more education choices. Jon England, thank you again for being on the Liberated podcast.
Thank you for having me.